Oh, I was like when you break your own backpack in situations like that, like, toxins that can be cold. And it's striking how worse the day is. Like, forget it. How am I going to be here?
Hello, everybody. Everybody in person as well as in our virtual audience. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is Left Bank Books in partnership with the St. Louis Democratic Socialists of America, presenting the fantastic Rob Larson, who will be here to discuss his new book, Mastering the Universe. So some notes before we begin. Today's event is only possible because of your support. When you support Left Bank Books, whether in-store or online, your money goes directly into our local economy. So it funds our streets and parks and more. It helps writers get the support that they deserve by allowing us to produce events such as this. So thank you all for shopping local and supporting this event tonight. We at Left Bank are always hard at work producing fantastic events of all kinds for readers of all ages. Of note, on September 10th, we've got Derek Kyra here with his new book, Slow and Sudden Violence, Why and When Uprisings Occur. By exposing the deep roots of contemporary racist injustice, Derek Kyra lays bare the failures of urban policy to overcome social inequalities as they have metastasized over time. Information about that event and a whole bunch more can be found on our website, left-bank.com. And as I mentioned, we're really excited to be teaming up with Democratic Socialists of America St. Louis chapters today. So here to introduce our author and to tell us more about them, please welcome Sean from the DSA.
Hey there. My name's Sean. I'm a member of the Executive Committee of St. Louis Democratic Socialists of America. We are the largest socialist organization in the United States. I got involved about 4 years ago after the 2020 elections, and I think like a lot of people kind of feeling like I need to do something, take some kind of action. And our chapter and DSA across the board spent a lot of time confronting power and confronting economic injustice and all the inequalities and things that Rob writes about and talks about. And so we were very excited when Rob reached out and asked us to co-present at the event. And so, as you read the things Rob writes about and get frustrated and upset, one of the actions that you can take is to get involved in your community and see what kind of changes you can make. And we've made a lot of progress over the years here in St. Louis, and it's the kind of fight that is worth fighting. And we've had some setbacks most recently with DSA member Corey Bush, but the president of the Board of Alders, Megan Green, is one of the founding members of our chapter. And we're still continuing to make progress and try to fight for working people. And so, if you stop by, if you're here in the store, you're welcome to grab some buttons or flyers or anything else about the chapter. We're involved with all the different things we do. We work with labor a lot. We do a lot of labor organizing, emergency workplace organizing. We are working on a Green New Deal for Public Schools program where we're confronting WashU on their tax exempt status and how much tax revenue they're taking away from U City Public Schools, St. Louis Public Schools. And we do a lot of electoral political organizing, most recently doing a ton of work with the Corey Bush campaign. Across the board, it's a great organization to get involved with. So we'd love to see you at one of our meetings. And other than that, without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Rob Larson. And thanks for coming.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. Appreciate it. It's great to be here and talking to you all here in St. Louis tonight. I am an economics professor, but for a community college, so don't get too impressed. I should tell you that. It's not really like an ivory tower. It's like a particle board tower, if that was possible. Been teaching for 19 years, and I just finished a 3-year project studying the very richest households in the U.S. and the world. So that's what we'll talk about tonight. So if you're like me, and I know I am, been horrified by the state of the world today, with American lifespans literally decreasing for much of the population, even as global wealth continues increasing. We have billionaires helping other dumber billionaires become president. We have pandemics thrashing austerity weakened public health systems to smithereens, and we have climate change slowly but surely baking, soaking, and burning large areas of the world. So the point of what I want to talk about is that all of this is for the benefit of a very small number of people. for a small number of usually wealthier households and families that are in circles of great wealth or power in the different lands of the world. And if you look at it across the board, it's sort of a ghastly rogues gallery of ruling class bastards. So their power over us, I think, has to be broken or we're totally screwed. So we'll talk about that a little now. So the first thing one of the early things I talk about in the book is just exactly the scale of the issue and just some of the dry statistics around money and wealth these days. Take that down to the tiniest level, it's pretty stunning stuff. If we go with the kind of classic 1% of households by wealth, just because that's become a convenient sort of like default metric that is used to refer to wealthier households, it's a starting point. In the US, the numbers we have these days, most recent year we actually have numbers for wealth concentration for is 2021, but mid-pandemic, the wealthiest 1% of households had 34.9% of all the national wealth in the country, which is a fairly stunning number. If you look at the middle class, like the 40%, that's between the top 10 and the bottom 50, the sort of middle class 40%, holds about 27.8% of the wealth compared to, again, 35% for that top 1 in 100 households. And to me, the real telling thing is always on these statistics of wealth distribution, just to look at the bottom 50%, which is usually the last unit of measurement that gets used to compare these wealth shares. And from region to region of the world, you see numbers like 2%. The US is 1.5% of all of our wealth, counting real estate and cash and investment assets. Many countries it's negative, of course, because if you have debts, obviously that's negative wealth. We have to offset that against what you actually own. So for the bottom 50%, about 1% of the national wealth, which is, it is what it is. That's not too far from the world numbers, which are a little more skewed globally. Wealthiest 1% have about 40.5% of total wealth. The bottom half globally, so the bottom 3.5 billion households in the world, hold 1.6% of that wealth, which is pretty intense. There was that New Deal period that we used to have from the Depression and World War II up until the early 80s, where we would tax wealthy households a lot more aggressively, or progressively in the technical terms. And we had a lot more serious wealth taxes and things along those lines. And we had a much diminished wealth gap at that time. At the very peak of the New Deal period, though, in the 70s, the share of wealth going to the top 10% never gets below 33%. So even when they're at their most taxed so that we can build the Golden Gate Bridge and put people on the moon and so forth, they never became poor. I should say that's still a very disproportionate share of wealth. But now we're very far away from those numbers now after the large series of tax relief bills that are sort of become the cornerstone of Republican economic policy. Certainly it's tax relief, and we're cutting taxes for everyone, and they will go down for everyone, but mostly for my wealthy friends. But what it means now is kind of a difficult thing, which is if we look over the last 40 years, that same wealthiest 1% globally took 27% of the world's per capita wealth growth. So the growth, the big famous capitalism thing, we grow the wealth, we build up the economy and produce more goods, grow the GDP. 27% of that growth went to those already very wealthy 1% of households, which is tough because a lot of my colleagues, economists, would say, well, yes, the wealth gap's a problem. You fix it by growing the whole economy. You grow the whole pie. And even though I get a bigger share of the pie than you, the whole pie is growing. And in that New Deal era, when the economy grew, everyone's share did grow. Like the deciles of the wealth distribution would grow at about as fast as the GDP did. That is over now, as that number shows. But the last really telling thing, again, in the book, I have a whole chapter on this, and people can pursue it as deeply as they wish, looking at today's wealth statistics. And I should say, most, not all, but most of the wealth statistical data that I use in the book comes from the WID, the World Inequality Database, which is a very, very globally valuable free intellectual project. It's run by Thomas Piketty, who wrote that famous Capital in the 21st Century book, and a couple famous American wealth gap scholars like Gabriel Zucman and Emmanuel Saez, and a number of other good scholars and their grad students and so on. So, and again, their website's fantastic, great data visualization. I really recommend going to the WID website. You'll find it if you just search for that. But the last thing I'll say from that whole chapter there is just the issue of ownership of the productive economy, ownership of what we call the capital, the physical capital that we use to produce goods and services, big farming estates, manufacturing complexes, oil refineries, huge data centers to store all of our online video and so on. Ownership of those assets is mainly corporate, of course. Generally, large incorporated firms are the ones that are big enough to raise the capital to make those huge investments. I mean, today's factories to make a modern semiconductor plant cost half. Actually, these ones now going up now cost over $1 billion to build a factory. That's making fancy high-tech smartphone chips. Again, chips with circuits so small you can't see them. Just a surreal challenge when you think about it, making something you can't view. So it is extra fancy, that's expensive, but all these assets are hundreds of millions of dollars. Only large firms can put those things up. Well, large corporations are owned by their stockholders. So who owns the stock? Well, this is a very lightly researched subject, and the large majority of the research on the subject comes from a New England economist, Edward Wolff, writing for the National Bureau of Economic Research. And just to get to the point of that, he found that there's a lot of discussion about how it's America, it's an investor society, and ownership culture, like George W. Bush used to say. And everyone owns America and has a stake in capitalism because everyone owns shares. Because there was a time in the 90s when a small majority of US households actually owned corporate equity. There was a time there when that was the case. These days, that number's gone down. The last time we got good new data on this, which is about 5 years ago, what we have says that 46.9% of households own any stock directly or indirectly in any form. So it is a minority of households that are in that position. But much more crucially is this point, Wolff, going again by that top 1% of households just by wealth, found that the top 1% owned 40% of all corporate equity, 40% of all traded stocks, and the top 10% owned 84% of all outstanding corporate equity. That's most of it. As I recall, I don't have this here, I think the top 20% owned 93%. That's almost a shutout now. That's very high. Now, of course, a number of people who are more fortunate, just working people, professional class workers like, doctors and attorneys and professors and engineers and scientists. If you're fortunate, you may own a small amount of stock indirectly, right? Through your retirement fund, usually some mutual fund arrangement where you own shares in a portfolio of shares of company. Oh God, finance. It's all about bits of some actual thing on earth. So if that appeals to you, go into finance. But that's important. Like the fact that the ownership of big firms and the big business that people talk about, this is mainly property of that wealthiest 1%. And that's important because after all, like large scale economic production is important. The only reason why cigarette lighters and socks are relatively affordable is because we mass produce them in stupendous volumes with giant economies of scale and centralized production locations. Like that's really important social wealth to keep our lights on and to make medical devices and drugs. Like we need and energy. We need large scale production. The question is who's in charge of that production and who owns it. Right now, it's corporate assets. They're run by their CEOs and boards. Boards are primarily appointed by stock owners. Your larger stock owners are appointed by a stockholder vote or something like that. So just that specific connection between your wealthier households and the corporate world, I think, is just something that's extra important. And that's kind of, I think, maybe that very first chapter, that's sort of the moral there. But that's kind of the numbers of it, which is important. But you got to get those out of the way before you talk about the juicy stuff. You can't have your dessert until you eat your vegetables. So I hope you enjoyed those Brussels sprouts. Let's talk about where the money goes, which is a lot more interesting. So the next thing I look at in the book is just the lifestyles of the stratospherically rich today, which is the short version is it's a completely different picture of life compared to what a middle class or working class person of any stature will experience. The first thing I usually start with is just real estate and having a place to live. Very important issue these days. We have a cost of living crisis for most Americans these days, starting with your rent and then continuing to everything else. But we should realize that wealthier households and families, your relationship with real estate is just a completely different experience. Most of us save up for many years to come up with like a down payment for some modest home, through a mortgage where you borrow the rest of the money, of course, and gradually pay for the house while you live in it. But if you're from like a wealthy family, you don't get mortgage, you don't borrow money to buy anything. You're not a debtor where you're borrowing money, you're a creditor into the financial system. You put large amounts of money into the financial institutions, into investment houses and so on. And that's how the capital eventually becomes available to the majority of us. So it's a totally different experience where you're owning properties, and often for many of these families, we're talking about multiple properties. Some of these households, may have a mortgage on it. It's important for wealthy households to maintain their perfect credit rating, just like it is for the rest of us. But that's the key thing, is not being primarily in debt for your real estate, which, managing the debt for your home is the main middle class question of life. Is, oh, she got really sick, or he lost his job. Can they keep the house? Is always the question. And often you can't, because it's very costly to meet interest payments on some entity that loaned you capital at profit, which provides them with an incentive for sure for the economic activity, but also puts the rest of us constantly on the hook to keep checks coming in so we can handle it. But that said, also, it's obviously not just a question of your relationship economically to your property, but to the property itself. When we look at these households at this level, we're not talking about split levels. We're talking about real estate. And of course, the best place you can ever go for that is this thing, the Wall Street Journal's mansion section. Very, very useful. It is hideous. This is every Friday in the Wall Street Journal. And if you're a subscriber, because you're a wealthy investor or a twisted creep economist like me, you can read this thing once a week. It's fantastic. Something about this just really does help create a real portal into this echelon of households. And it's kind of interesting. So we have a number of properties we could use to give you a sense of this. Obviously, mansion is the name of the supplement, and the mansions themselves are pretty serious. I remember one recent article from this last year sometime, referring to a renovation in a Hamptons vacation household, the Hampton beaches out on East Long Island, the New Yorker kind of Wall Street vacation area. They referred to renovations being done in one of these homes, and a $30,000 bill for one room on the curtains, specifically. And it's really, I'm sure it's a very tasteful window dressing, but I guess I'd rather have a large car, I suppose. But again, I'm middle class, so it doesn't make sense to me. But that's pretty significant. I like that. Another kind of major Southern California estate is described in one of these pages, referring to the estate as having, and I quote, 40 rooms, or 60 if you included the servants' quarters. Great. Plus the walk-in silver, fur, and wine vaults in the basement. Very tasteful. Of course, that's in mansions. Obviously, another big thing for families at this level is penthouses, getting very, very large and fancy apartments in big cities. The record for a penthouse transaction in the U.S. was when a hedge fund founder, Ken Griffin, bought a gigantic, hideous unit in Manhattan for $238 million, just shy of $250 million on one place, which which economists will tell you is a lot. It's a lot of money. That's nice. A lot of the apartments at this level too, if you look at the listings in Mansion, like the boring bits at the back where they're listing places for purchase or high-end leasing, many of these, you can have the option of adding things to your penthouse purchase. And one of them is a parking space. Very sought after in Manhattan. I don't know what you know about New York, but it's not famous for parking. And you can add a parking space to many of these penthouses if you wish, a parking slot in your building for about $1 million or so added to the price, which is a lot. The middle class American earns about $1.3 million in their lifetime. So that's a lot. But on the other hand, if you're buying a $50 million penthouse, that's like a rounding error, an extra million. I'll throw it in there. Maybe I'll buy a car someday. Put it in there. That's fun. And again, the New York rich are kind of the source of a lot of famous old money stories about wealthy families, which if you do research for a book like this, you learn a lot of. There's a ton of these in the book, just one or two of my favorites. One I always remember, forget her name, you'll see it in the book. It's a 1950s Manhattanite on the Upper East Side, of course, who would send her butler, living in New York, in the pleasant seasons, would still send her butler all the way back out to the Hamptons each week to dig up soil for her Pekingese peaches to poop on. She really likes the soil out there. You know what, Jeeves? Just drive. Jeeves. That's like an 8-hour round trip. Depends on how far out east you are in the Hamptons, I guess. So you get the perfect soil for peas. That's a good one. There's plenty of episodes like this. I don't want to pick on that one person. It is of a type. So that's interesting. And coping with this stuff these days is an issue. There's a lot of resentment of the wealth gap, of course, and a lot of constituencies try to deal with this in different ways. So some more progressive constituencies like London and New York have passed ordinances requiring high-end developers or just real estate developers, if they're building market rate apartments, which often means luxury units, you have to include at least some affordable units in the structure. And these developers grudgingly they comply with that, and you'll have some relatively affordable, modest units in these giant, fancy, high-end new buildings. But at some point during the construction process, they decided they didn't want to just have one door. So you have a separate entrance in these structures that are built under this requirement. And there's favorable tax angles on it too if you build these units. There's separate entrances. And if you go through the one for the market rate units, it's very large, expansive, very lots of lights in the lobby, and there's a sign that the concierge is available, of course, and so on. And if you go in through the affordable rental units entrance, to their elevator, it's a undecorated off-white corridor with security signs and a sign saying you are under surveillance in this space. It's funny, and what they call it in the New York real estate industry is, and these are not my terms, this is from, I believe this was the Wall Street Journal or New York Times. Own coverage of this was the real estate agents use the phrase poor doors. But yes, those are the poor doors for the regular poor people to walk through. And I don't have this quote in front of me, it's in the book, but one of the agents, I think this was speaking to a Guardian reporter, if I recall correctly. She said, this door is here so the two social strata don't have to meet. I was like, that's candid. That's good in the book. This is the kind of stuff I get into here a little bit. Obviously, many of the owners of this level of property, of course, have multiple properties, sometimes like many properties. Half the reason you get these is to have a place to sock away your incredibly fast-growing ruling class fortune. Again, you're soaking up, 27% of per capita economic growth over my whole lifetime. You got to find places to sock away that money, and sometimes your wealth advisor just can't come up with those stock dips fast enough. So you just buy some penthouses, buy some land. It's mostly appreciating in the US these days for 10 other economic reasons. And you just use it as a place to store your fortunes. But it means even if it's a place you do go to, it's one of many properties. Often these are vacation homes, like specific season vacational homes. That's my winter place, and that's my summer place. And here's the main place, and my fun city apartment, and then my kid's house. Like this kind of thing. So you see is that these high-end units, which are so expensive, are inhabited by humans very, very seldom, tiny amounts of the time. Like these people's pied-à-terres and pet sitters often talk to the press, take little candid photos and get away with leaking them to the New York Post and so on. So you get glimpses of these. They say, I don't know, the owner is a Russian person. This is his dog. I wanted the plants here or whatever. And some of them can really say, everyone in this building hates each other. They never hang out together. They just see each other as rival users of the concierge. This is interesting. There's other goofier cases as well, like when Larry Ellison bought Lanai, one of the Hawaiian islands. 2013, he bought it, like 97%. So stand on the 3% and laugh at it, I guess. That's pretty serious. But to me, really, when you look through the real estate stuff, what's striking is the household labor. So you own a place this large, there's no cleaning yourself, even if you felt like it. Like it's not within a human's energy level. It's large. You need a staff to keep it in, pay all your bills for you and keep it in landscapers and cleaners and so on. So there's a book by Frank Rich, another business journalist a while ago. And he's a pretty extensive just description of the way high-end household labor works. And again, he's a business journalist, so he just reports this with just the straightest face you've ever seen, which isn't this interesting, how this works. And they talk about the, quote, ballet of serving dinner to a wealthier household, for example, when you have service, when you have like full-on household service. I just remember this one bit, I'm quoting Frank Rich here, he says, he's describing an academy that teaches high-end household staff how to behave around the household. He says, this is a place called Starkey. He says, most of all, the Starkey students learn never to judge their employers, whom they call principals. If a principal wants to feed her Shih Tzu praised by beef tenderloin steaks every night, the butler should serve it up with a smile. If a principal is in Palm Beach and wants to send his jet to New York to pick up a bottle of Chateau Latour from his Hampton cellar. The butler makes it happen, no questions asked. Like, to me, that is the real picture of these households. Like, once you have a place to live that's so grand, you end up being a boss just at home of a fairly decent sized staff. And of course, you'll have one main staff member whose job is to manage the rest of it. Who these days you don't call your head butler anymore. That's very old world, you know. So you call it your household manager. It's much more, much more clinical sounding. So that's interesting. There's a mile of material on the slimy, scandalous way these people live. I recommend taking a look at it in the book if you're interested. But the last thing we'll look at before the final portion is just to talk a little about the relationship of all this to the environment and to the biggest single environmental problem we recognize these days, of course, which is climate change. I have a chapter on this in the book. I probably won't stun that many people here or listening at home or in transit, but it is a fact that the proportions of carbon dioxide and CO2 equivalents are pretty proportionate to the wealth and especially consumption levels of the households. So as a result, and again, going with numbers here, this is something that's getting a lot more research interest, especially by scholars associated with that World Inequality Database, which again, is a great thing to search and take a look at. They now have separate pages for the income and wealth distributions for almost every country in the world, using data that they are very impressively innovative in coming up with, because many countries don't like this stuff tracked particularly, or anyway, don't feel like paying to do it through their national statistical agencies. But we're finding now that, going again with the WID numbers here, that wealthiest 1% of households emits about 17% of all the greenhouse gas equivalents each year. The richest 10% of households emit 47.6% of the total.
Wow.
Almost half the pie in just that wealthiest 1 out of 10 households, that is. And again, we see something similar with wealth growth. That richest 1% is responsible for 21% of emissions growth over the last 30 years. So again, like each of us, of course, with our large American consumption, our modern energy use, we are each making our contribution. We should recognize, like, the largest contributions, of course, are happening over our heads, these very high wealth levels and people with their personal planes, which we'll get to in a moment here. But it's also annoying because, as many people point out, a lot of people who are seen to be environmental advocates in media are often the most stinking rich people you ever saw in your society. And so people like Oprah or Taylor Swift or Emma Stone, and who God preserve them all. But they have a habit of going to climate events on private planes. Mixed messages, I would call that. That's difficult. Because, of course, obviously, if you're flying on a privately owned jet, a private plane, the average private jet actual owner has an average net wealth of $1.5 billion, very, very high. But the issue here, of course, is that private jets have about 10 times the emissions equivalent per mile as just a commercial flight, let alone comparing it to taking a bus or a train or something like that. So pretty stratospheric numbers there. And of course, the jets themselves the interiors are the craziest ruling class fantasies you can imagine. Hand-woven tie carpets, Versace china, and Christopher silver. One place had an entire interior trim made out of alligator skin, which is impressive. And of course, the really annoying thing is when we look at the limited efforts so far to break down the flight patterns for these kinds of planes, incredibly commonly, the flights are very, very short distance. Like over a third of them are 90 minutes or less. Which of course means you could have not only flown a commercial flight, you could have just had your driver drive you there. So not that you drive, obviously, let's not go crazy. You could have had your chauffeur, or your driver, as we now say. Again, chauffeur and butler, that's very old world. Tech billionaires, you're more detached. These are just more HR-mediated positions to you. So your driver can take you there. Like Elon Musk, for example, did several trips just over this last year between San Jose and San Francisco, which are both Bay Area cities. And it's a trip that trip's like half hour on the BART, on the Mateo County transit system there, which is annoying. So these jets are pretty crazy. And again, those short flights, of course, besides just being annoying, that's, of course, the most stratospherically inefficient way to fly these inefficient machines, because, of course, on any kind of flight, majority of the energy use is in takeoff and landing, of course, getting that beast in the air and then slowing it down by running the engines in reverse when you land, right? That's the idea. So those are pretty crazy. And again, just to finish it off here, one European NGO that I cite in the book They estimate that among European private jet use, this was a European entity, so they were looking at wealthy Europeans and private jet employment, and they found that 41% of those flights are empty legs. This is not even with a plane. Like an empty plane. I mean, the pilot, obviously. Someone flying the plane, just like an empty, silent interior with fancy things and surfaces, just waiting for some wealthy inheritor to get on in Monaco or Paris or wherever. So that's pretty rough. And then, of course, we should get to the really bad part, which is not even private jet travel, but of course, private space travel, which is a very fun, exciting new hobby for a tiny class of wealthy scumbags these days. Most of this travel, it's always nominally for research or to develop new industries, but realistically, so far, it's just a new ruling class method of playing. And if you look at the fun playing that they're doing, it's impressive. So a lot of these are very short flights where you technically are reaching space, like when Jeff Bezos took William Shatner up there annoyingly last year. That was an 11-minute flight, takeoff to splashdown, so short-lived, use of many tens of millions of dollars. But we estimate that one 11-minute flight can emit about 200 tons of CO2 equivalent, meaning, and again, I'm just quoting here from the World Inequality Database, it therefore takes a few minutes in space travel to emit at least as much carbon as an individual from the bottom billion of the population will emit in their entire lifetime. So that's interesting. The last thing I look at in the book is how we're going to cope with or try to deal with or, God willing, overthrow finally this kind of ruling class. I mean, there's a lot to say about this, of course, and the book goes into some detail. Just to mention a couple of things. Right now, we have a very, entrenched economic system. Our resources, are corporate property, and those belong to wealthier households. This system is here, and we have markets that decide prices for goods, and we have private property, and that's usually what we call capitalism. Those two things is kind of your classic definition there. So a lot of us are talking about attempting to historically move beyond capitalism as an economic system. Kind of the classic argument is that every economic system has its role, and often when they come into existence is because they're solving some horrible problem, like feudalism. Something that develops in Western Europe as the Roman Empire collapses. And this huge empire built on long trade networks on those fine Roman roads breaks down as barbarians gradually conquer different chunks and break it into little fiefs. And it becomes more about trying to have basic self-reliance in a large estate, or latifundia as they called it then. That becomes feudalism and manorialism in Western Europe, but solving the problem of coping with a declining, crashing empire. There's a real case, we achieve stability in this little area, and you'll give a tenth of your food to the Lord, and then he has to go kill Arabs for the king if he wants. So not a great social structure in general, but when in a dying empire that's falling apart, and you're watching your kids get skinny, you're grateful for just having a fort that you can stand on, On the other hand, then you get a century of complete hideous stagnation as a result of that through the Middle Ages in the Western world. And so capitalism comes along through mercantile trade growth and eventually the Industrial Revolution. It's a huge positive step forward for humanity because now we're creating some real wealth that can actually grow over time. And this is one thing we say about capitalism, and that all of its critics, including Marx himself, if we're interested in that, had to say is it's an economic system that constantly looks for sources of investment and profit and growth. Now, of course, much of that goes to the benefit of some tiny new wealthy ruling class like I'm talking about here. But it means that social system had its place in developing up a big, productive apparatus that lets us have transportation and energy and indoors and heating and entertainment and medicine and so on. But now we end up with a situation where we have this hideous ruling class of billionaires just melting the climate so they can have fun on their private planes. It's pretty rough. We kind of see every social system, it's solving a need when it starts, and then it sticks around for 600 more years than it should. Is kind of how these things sometimes could be argued to go. So if we look about moving to that extent beyond capitalism to something that we have a democratic control over, which is clearly not the case today. I mean, so many things are popular that we cannot have. I think it's 88% of Democrats and 34% of Republicans support Medicare for all. Some public government insurance program, usually we call it a Medicare expansion. That's very popular. No one in this country likes industrial outsourcing of jobs, and it's defined the last 30 years of the job market, at least for large sectors of it, So, I mean, that's capitalism. You're following market incentives and not necessarily what the giant majority of the people nominally being served would want. So when we talk about building up a movement for socialism or democratic socialism, it's often along those simple lines of just some relatively modest policies like Medicare for all, a energy transition through something like a Green New Deal or something similar. These things have extreme levels of popular support. And just the other thing to realize is this society is the richest one that has ever existed. Maybe will ever exist, we'll find out. And again, our GDP in this country is $25 trillion a year. What does that even mean? Remember, that's the value of all the goods we make in a single year. $25 trillion worth, so 25,000 of billions of dollars worth. Stratospherically high numbers. And when you look at what like Americans are how hard we have to hustle to come up with just enough money to cover medical bills. I think it's a third of the GoFundMe's going now, or for healthcare related expenses. Which just, there's so much money in this country and people are reduced so low by this stuff. It's pretty rough. I mean, the first thing that many people say when they're injured is don't call the ambulance. I can't afford that stuff. Like, I'm sure you get an ambulance. What are you, crazy? Even if you're insured. Often it's, American insurance, where you have insurance and we take a fifth of your paycheck. That part works great. The part where we pay you money for health expense, that's, very difficult. Technically, according to your plan, we technically don't have to. So get out. This kind of stuff is where people want a Medicare, Medicare for all or other similar arrangement. And so this is the modest stuff we talk about with at least democratic socialism. Now, how we get these things is all about the labor movement. I mean, historically, that's always been the way. Through one kind of pattern or another, every society has its own specific historical circumstances. But with a lot of consistency, it's usually about some version of organized workforce rising up in some way and getting crushed, and then they rise up, and then they get crushed, and then like 30 more times later, they get a revolution and put a republic in. Like that's usually how these things go. The United States, we've had a big decline in the labor movement since its peak in 1953, when about a third of American workers were covered by collective bargaining units at that time. Since then, it's gradually decreased and really fallen since the 80s with Reagan's big change to national labor laws. But we're having a fairly impressive labor renaissance lately, I would say, not to overdraw the point. Fingers crossed, but it's been strong. By now, we have 331 Starbucks locations that are covered by, that have voted in a union. Some of them have collective bargaining agreements in place. Some management is still dragging their feet. They do love doing that. But that's impressive. America's port workers have really been on a tear. They're a very strong organization. They're able to plausibly threaten to go on strike. Technically illegal since the Patriot Act made that not legal to do work stoppages in national security relevant transportation facilities. But they're still able to sort of get away with it, which is important. If workers have to do this kind of stuff to get any version of the value that they create in the marketplace. This is why figures like Martin Luther King, who are trying to run a civil rights movement of very poor people, focused in significant part on getting them organized in different like labor-based bargaining units. I mean, the man died supporting a public sanitation worker, trash collector strike in Memphis, Tennessee. That's what he was doing there at the time of his assassination, So we're seeing some progress there, which is very positive to see. We have a few unionized Apple retail stores now. Microsoft has its only unions anywhere in its giant $3 trillion corporate structure in its video gaming section, where it's been unable to prevent these tiny numbers of cynical, jaded-ass game designers from voting in collective bargaining units over their 7-person breaks, I imagine. It's often small workspaces here, which has an effect on this kind of dynamic. So that's interesting. Amazon's a tougher nut to crack, of course. The famous single workplace, that Staten Island sorting facility that's covered by a collective bargaining agreement. Just quote the New York Times here, pointing out that when they failed that second Staten Island warehouse push earlier this year, the Times noted that the erosion of the union's early support showed the power that employers have in campaigning against unions by holding mandatory meetings and talking to employees doing work hours about the downside of organizing. The company's slogan, "Do it without dues," was pushed to workers in text messages, mandatory meetings with the boss, and signs on bathroom stalls. A lot of money is at stake with this stuff. If we have to pay for the workers to have health insurance or raises, that'll really bite into our free cash flow. So it's worth throwing a lot of money at trying to crush it up front. It's like an investment in keeping your workforce atomized and definitely not getting the full value of their work contribution. But this is sort of like the earlier step, kind of the beginning steps, I would say, of what we need to do here. And I would just finish by saying the real difference between having a market economy and some version of a socialized economy, whatever we conceive that to mean, is what we call expropriation, where ownership of the big capital property is no longer in private hands anymore. Through one means or another, through nationalization or through direct worker control, which is interesting. Number of possibilities here, and this is America. This is a country where people like to invent and experiment. In the United States, we don't want to have like too restrictive of a blueprint when we talk about this kind of stuff. But the real weaknesses to the system are pretty real. So I just want to Albert Einstein himself said that, quoting him now from his famous essay for Monthly Review in 1949, he said, "Private capital tends to become concentrated in few hands. Under existing conditions, private capitalists inevitably control, directly or indirectly, the main sources of information. And I'm convinced there's only one way to eliminate these grave social evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy. In such an economy, the means of production are owned by society itself and are utilized in a planned fashion," which is interesting. To me, like the real socialist exponent we should think of is George Orwell. He was the definitive Western world's critic of totalitarianism and the Stalinist Soviet bloc. But all of his writing was for democratic socialism, and he was very open about this. And in his famous essay about why Britain should adopt a socialist economy after World War II, which was called The Lion and the Unicorn, it's a tiny pamphlet, you should check it out. He said the only thing for which we can combine that is positive is the underlying ideal of socialism, justice and liberty. And so the final question then is, how do we try to reach that point? I mean, obviously that would be some distance away. As I said, we have a pretty entrenched capitalist, market-based economy. Our resources are, very firmly in the private sector. The United States is a much weaker labor and socialist political part of the spectrum than most other developed countries do. Most other countries have a long history before capitalism, and so there's institutions, like guilds and community organizations and labor that predate markets and modern industry. In the United States, we don't have that. This country was made to be capitalist, and who knows how long that will continue. But that was indeed a major part of the whole idea of the founders, was to have a government that's weak at regulating property and regulating wealth, and definitely a historic success to that mission there. So what could we do? That means we have like a long road in front, because it would mean just from the beginning organizing workers back to a significant level where we're capable of actually taking meaningful social action. So people often point out in the United States, people fear the government and they have guns to keep themselves safe from the government that has the National Guard and then the military. That's the thing sometimes people point out. On the other hand, in France, for example, the government fears the public because the public is organized in unions, and if you try to raise their pension age, like Macron did last year, you might still succeed, but you're going to pay for it. Like the electricity at Macron's official residence got shut off for a month and a half by the striking utility workers. Like, oh, you're going to make my mom work longer before she can retire. I forgot how this panel worked. What is this? It's confusing. If that's what you do. When you have organization, the government can't just tell you what to do, because maybe you all won't work tomorrow and the trash starts piling up in the streets and I don't remember what my phone looks like anymore because I haven't been able to charge it in 3 days. Like, that's the government bay, not by having a machine gun that you accidentally turn on yourself later or something, statistically. So that's the first thing to consider, is getting real organization into this society where people want to be on their phones and alone watching TV so frequently. Labor is a basic way of doing that, of course. We definitely need to grow our socialist representation in government at all levels, including the national level. A uphill struggle, as my friends here at the St. Louis DSA are very familiar with. We've had real victories there, and the fact that we attract so many millions of dollars to crush our cool candidates shows how important work is and how much it annoys people who have a material interest in avoiding that kind of economic redistribution of wealth. But if we want to really make a break from capitalism, it would require expropriation, and that would mean national political resolve, like a strong national majority calling for that, for it to be democratic socialism. And then, of course, I mean, ruling classes never go, all right, we lost the vote, you win. We'll stop being rich, I guess. That sucks. They don't do that. They go, all right, cops kill them. There's usually a point where ruling elites of any type historically turn to violence rather than giving up even their petty privileges, let alone like the big power, So that's where you have to have labor ready to do what they call the old general strike, where everyone goes out of work, and then that's the way you convince ruling elites that they have to give it up. So Bangladesh just had a fairly large uprising last week. You might have heard about that. And they drove out their dictator of 20 years of decades, of multiple decades. And that's just about the poorest, most hopeless country you can think of from an American perspective, and they're capable of doing this. Like, I bet we could do that. That would be great. Like, this is how you show people you're not a public that can just be pushed around, which is not necessarily the reputation that we have built up as Americans there. So I think that's enough to say, these are the kinds of things you can do to start to make some strides against the extreme power and wealth of the ruling class. It's interesting. And there's positive things you can do, and it makes you feel positive to do them. If you go to some local meetings or join some kind of local entity where you're physically hanging out with people, not on an app, where you're actually there and present, it has a positive feeling on you. I hope you feel better about being in a society that can feel oppressive at times when we're all watching these billionaires take over fun things and try to ruin them for us. There's stuff that you can do to make things less hopeless and to feel better yourself. And I just finished saying, if you're going to do kind of work like this, or try to, organize to one day oppose the interests of the ruling class, just remember too, it's rough, long road, but you deserve to have a good time too. So always take a moment to have a laugh at the expense of the ruling class. They can afford it. Thank you. Thanks, guys. So we have some time. I don't know if people would like to do a Q&A or something like that for a few moments here. Maybe take it up to 7 or something like that. So people are interested in, or if people have more of a comment than a question, we can consider entertaining that too. Yeah, Matt, go for it.
Okay. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, I don't know, what you were able to examine if you came across like sort of the ruling class psyche, because I think I've helped a lot of people form unions. I've unionized across workplace and various struggles. And the people at the top are apoplectic that they will have to give up any form of control over other people that they have. And workers having unionization or progressive taxation, they'll be fine with these things. Maybe unfortunately, usually still rich, but they are so determined to stop this. And I'm just kind of, it's kind of baffling, when you kind of think about it logically, how much they have, but how still so upset and angry they are about people who question if they got what they deserve.
Fair enough. That's a really good question. And that's, something I definitely chop into in the book a little bit more than we just did here. But I would say the ruling class psyche is a really interesting subject. There's a lot to say about it. One of the first points I make in the book is if you're in this kind of position, if you're this wealthy, and not just wealthy, if you're kind of in this prominent position for any reason, if you're super rich, if you're powerful, if you're a senator or something, or if you're just famous, if you're just a big famous celebrity, things happen to you that are sort of similar. And what happens is everyone around you is excited about you for that specific reason. No one really likes you. They're excited because you're the head of the Senate Appropriations Committee, or you're a trillionaire, or you're Taylor Swift, or whomever, right? And what that means is after a while, everyone around you, you're competing for favor of that important or rich or famous person, for whether it's for money or to be in their Instagram shots or whatever it is. And so soon everyone around you is kind of in a kiss your ass competition. Everyone tells you how great you are, and I'm the only one who sees how great you are, Elon. You gotta, I'm the one who always believed in you. Remember that? Please remember that. You're great. And so just think what it would do to you mentally if everyone around you only told you were great and never told you when you were being a dumb jerk, which most humans do at some point. You would lose contact with reality. That is what would occur. And indeed, if you look at some of these characters in power or wealth, and certainly celebrities, this clearly takes place. There's a complete loss of the idea that not only you could do anything bad, but certainly you should get in trouble for doing anything. Now, specifically, though, we're talking about organizing workers in someone's workplace. That does definitely strike very specifically deeply for a lot of private sector, business-oriented wealthier people, because it requires admitting that you really are in a position of power, and some people don't like it. And some people are annoyed, and they think they're underpaid, or they want to have some control over their work conditions, so they want better health insurance. Because every one of these guys, my last book was on big tech, and I read a lot and learned a lot about tech billionaires and these Silicon Valley molds of CEOs and investors. Every one of them was well, yeah, I invested capital and led some investors in doing a $40 million fundraising round. And my firm employs 20 people, and they work famously hard and work overnight and do code stuff. So I guess I'm a boss, but I'm cool though. But I am cool. Like, I'm not the boss. I am the boss, but I'm like a cool boss. And so whenever these guys finally come in and say, we want a collective bargaining agreement, like, well, we're not friends anymore? I thought I was the cool boss, and now you're saying you want to organize yourselves in some way. Like, I'm not doing a good enough job. Like, there is something about that that really definitely does. It seems to be taken personally more frequently than other things, where it's, well, we feel you should have to pay a capital gains tax or something. Like, they might like it or not, but it's not like, and this is because we all think that you're a dick in the workplace, which is what organizing a union does sometimes have as its subtext, So that's a fascinating piece of it. And I mean, really fundamentally though, you're talking about people who have a lot of wealth and power, and you're kind of up in the clouds looking down at people, frequently literally, as we said earlier. And these things just have a real effect on you. And it's always like, any problem I feel like dealing with, I can solve it. Anyone who criticizes me, they're just jealous, or they're trying to get money from me, like all my other so-called friends are. Like, very frequently, these people feel they have no friends, because they don't. Because even if you have like real friends who were your friends before, like, those are the friends who either criticize you so you stop having them around. So I got all these other people who just think I'm fantastic. Or they stop criticizing you because, like, well, I don't know, my mom needs money for her surgery. I mean, I guess I could just tell him he's great, whatever. I can swallow my pride for a while. These things have real effects on people. And if you look at high-end therapists in New York and London who treat this kind of client, they say that's an incredibly common diagnosis, is people who feel paranoid and isolated, because it's had an effect on the sincerity and nature of all of their friendships. Because you have too much wealth, and now you can't even have a normal relationship with someone because you're so stinking rich. So again, some socialism is self-care, just to help these poor rich people. We should confiscate some of their wealth just so they can go back to having normal relationships. So, I fixed the whole problem.
They could get rid of some of their money and do good things with it and be halfway normal, but still like be able to afford some stuff. So I guess I don't get like why some billionaire hasn't solved the Flint water crisis, because they could be the hero of the world and still buy all their jets and all that other bullshit.
It is true. And the thing is, I refer to that case specifically in this book, right? The estimated costs, like the high end of the estimated costs to replace not just like Michigan's, but the whole state's lead water delivery pipes. It's a lot of infrastructure to replace. It wasn't known then what the issues were, and this isn't affordable. You can see why it happened. But it's not something for like a developed society. Like, lead poisons everyone, especially little kids. It's really bad. So the high-end estimates to replace all of that lead piping is in the neighborhood of $5 billion, which is a very large amount of money. Compared to the amounts we're talking about here, I mean, literally, Michael Bloomberg 4 years ago had a big new stock sale, and he made more than that amount in one day. And he could put himself in history forever if he put it towards that use. No. Here's what you want to do. I have a separate section in the book on philanthropy among the rich. And this really is a big part of understanding them. Because they absolutely do say, why do I have all this wealth? Like Melinda French Gates, Bill Gates' ex-wife, said, it's so arbitrary. She said, it feels so arbitrary that I have all this money. Because it friggin' is. Like, it's an accurate feeling, Melinda. You are experiencing it correctly. They said, it's so arbitrary, so I'm giving this money away. And the first thing everyone says, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, they're giving the money away. Everyone on TV all the time, I hear about they're giving things away. They're building facilities or helping people in the developing world, or putting out vaccines. And so we should thank them for that. Well, this goes all the way back to Nelson Rockefeller. Like, Bill Gates and Rockefeller are almost perfect analogs from the 1890s and 1990s. Both of them discovered philanthropy once their reputation as evil ruling class monopolists became national phenomena. And once Rockefeller was in the press is like, wow, if you don't sell your little oil rig to this guy, he will like pay his oil cronies to not deliver your oil on the rails anymore. And if that doesn't work, he'll send in goons and threaten you or threaten to beat up your family. And then again, why don't you just take my money? Usually you can just buy these guys out. Some version of threats and buying them out. Like, that is also the Microsoft story in the 90s. These guys, once they're up on antitrust charges, like Bill Gates, people forget now that he's all old and grandfatherly and has his charity to hide behind. In the 90s, he was literally a Simpsons villain. Not figuratively on The Simpsons as a villain, actually a couple times. It's like showing how much that had become a national observation. That's the time when he made his multi-$10 billion contributions to his foundation. And Rockefeller, it's the same story. Once he started looking bad, starts shelling out money to the East Coast churches, gave, it was the equivalent of $5.5 million in today's dollars to the University of Chicago, who've been a bunch of right-wing billionaire worshipers ever since. Unrelatedly, I'm sure. I remember it was this is in the book, I should have this right here, but it's the head of Euclid Church in, I think it was Cincinnati, it was one of the Ohio cities, I think it was Cincinnati, who said, people have accused Rockefeller of monopoly. This is almost a quote, it's from memory. He says, they accuse Rockefeller of monopoly, but he has laid his money on the altar and thus sanctified it. This is the reverend of a church speaking here. Where's the power of money? He probably built him a big church and gave him money to give to like real alms to the poor and stuff. So that's the thing. These guys have the money. They don't give it away. You give out crumbs of it at a time, and you create a gigantic foundation to like decide exactly which charities get this drop of money. Here's a whole crumb for you. And you get entities like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has a bigger annual budget than the entire World Health Organization. We should expropriate these people's money. It's too much. Like, why should, even if let's say they're not doing it for their power, which is the case. Since read the accounts, it's all like, I saved these Africans with my clinic. I saved them by giving them a well with fresh water. I'm amazing. Who the hell put you in charge of being God to these poor people? Half these countries are super poor because some Europeans plundered them anyway 250 years ago. So it's pretty sick to then go there and build a half-assed medical clinic with insecticide-covered mosquito repellents that they then tear down and use for fishing nets because you don't understand what actually is happening with these local poor people. This just becomes like another form of them being little deities on earth a lot of the time. Even if, again, clearly it's like for a general benefit with charity. But just, again, comes down to why should you be in charge of this? Like Melinda's right. Like it's so arbitrary. Indeed. Like Gates didn't deserve the money, and I don't support what his divorcee does particularly either. Like this much money, it should be somehow up to public decision about what gets built with this stuff. So again, some of these high-end yachts right here, I skipped over this bit. Like Larry Ellison's another one of our big tech billionaires out where I'm from on the West Coast. And his largest yacht cost $400 million. It's enough to build 3 hospitals. It's too much. It's just too much wealth. We should take it from you. It's even if you're doing a great job, that's too much wealth for you to control. And I mean, they're probably not. I mean, look at how those private jets. Look at how these. Again, if you look at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is changing its name, I guess I should stop saying that. If you talk to people in charity and development aid, like the Gates Foundation is now considered to be this great gatekeeper because it controls such a huge portion of the public funding pool that exists for health investments. So it's, grant reviewers and, decision-making officials are in a position just to decide how much aid goes to different countries, like a position that, in the past, imperial governments were in charge of, but that local poor people are never in charge of ever. So it's interesting, but to me, like the philanthropy of it is just like a little extra disgusting fig leaf on the whole process. But it's impossible. I'm glad you mentioned that because it's impossible to really talk about this without mentioning that. Because it does work. If you look at Rockefeller's Wikipedia page, it's a famous businessman and philanthropist. Bill Gates, businessman and philanthropist. Like half of their title is not adjudicated monopolist and debatably in charge of violent goon squads when they were building their monopolies. You can make a strong case for it. I was philanthropist, lover of man, lover of other people. Even though we're looking at some of the most abusive tyrants and empire builders in the world. So that's just an extra obnoxious bit of it, at least in my mind. Mister.
You can find examples of people voluntarily distributing their wealth, and you just mentioned for several reasons. I can't think of any example of anyone voluntarily distributing power.
That is true. Power is a rare currency, You can work and get some money, getting power.
In fact, what you're pointing out, I think, in the last bit there was people distributing their wealth in order that their power not be challenged.
It's true. That's a very thoughtful way of putting it, stranger. And I would say further, that's a major piece of it too. And when you look, institutions or people with power, it's true, they're very zealous about it. And people and governments are famous for never giving up power once they've gotten it. It does happen. The Federal Reserve, for example, America's central bank, usually run by former bankers, not considered to be a very anti-establishment entity. It kind of keeps banking on what rails that it has. Like it took over the commercial lending market when that market crashed in the 2008 financial crisis. Short-term lending to big firms to smooth out their chunky expenses, let them handle payroll and stuff. That's normally a Wall Street operation, but for a few years they wouldn't do it because it was the credit crisis after the big terrifying crash. Banks are scared to lend. 2010, that market recovers and the Fed withdraws from the market. Like they gave up their control over that because it's from, it may be nominally government, but it's primarily a capitalist institution. Oh, good, my boys are back from the bond office to run this market. We're happy to withdraw now. Half of us will be working for them again when our terms of service end in 4 years, It's like there is like some fluidity with power. It is interesting. But again, that's what it gets to with those union organizing campaigns and why it gets so quickly to business people's hearts when they find out that there's a union drive on their shop floor or whatever. It's like, that's not just my money that comes from that. That's my control. I built that. I have power over that. And I don't want my little Lego figures to tell me I've been a bad Lego builder here. Oh, you're actual people. Okay, whatever. But that is the relationship to power of all this is fascinating too. And I have a little section on how this relates to government power, of course, which is a huge deal, but we've seen enough billionaires entering a system of power to see the relationship that does exist there. It's interesting. But I don't know, we've been going for an hour now. Maybe I should shut up and maybe folks want to chat after or something like that. Like, that's cool. But I just want to thank you guys. It's been a fun talk. It's a beautiful bookstore here. It's great to come out. Love St. Louis. Love whenever I can get down to this town. So pleasure to see you all. Thanks for coming out. Lower the temperature of the city by 20 degrees.
Right?
Thank you so much, and thank you to you all for joining us today. We've got copies of Mastering the Universe at the desk if you don't have yours yet. And then we will move some things around and get some books signed up front here. We've also got all the pamphlets and other goodies from the DSA. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.